This is some Fairisle made on my 8-button machine. My particular model does not have automatic Fairisle, but it's really not very difficult to accomplish, and that's what we're going to look at today. What you are observing is an unfinished hat. I haven't finished gathering and I haven't sewn the edges together. This one will fit a baby. And so as to make it more fun to practice and to show you how little Fairisle it actually takes to give a project some zip, I'm going to show you how to make the hat from start to finish. If we could look at knitting really close up, this is what it would look like. Each of these lines that I am now tracing is a row. They're locked together. And because of this bumpiness, the shape that the yarn takes to create a stitch, there's some widthwise stretch. Because at no time is there a straight, continuous strand of yarn that would be rigid and stop the stretch. Now here is a Fairisle row with the plain black ballpoint pen. I drew a line that indicates knitting every other stitch in one color. Then with the blue pen, I drew the alternate color in. Now we have the same number of stitches as on a normal row, but every long stretch, there's a blue one, there's a black one, blue, black. There's a stitch in this position, and it would stretch, but this is not as stretchy. So for this reason, Fairisle tends to be less stretchy, more dense, because we've got two yarns in the same place, and to pull in a little bit from the stockinette gauge. If we're knitting a whole garment with Fairisle, for that reason we tend to go up a stitch size. In the case of a hat, it's desirable for the brim to pull in and be a little firm. So I'm going to keep the same stitch size throughout. In this case, I'm using 7. It works well for these yarns. When you have to set up Fairisle, either manually, which we're not doing today, or in the semi-manual method that the 8-button machine can arrange, it would be somewhat laborious to do a whole garment. This would have taken much, much longer if I did what's between my fingertips in Fairisle. On the other hand, that doesn't worry me much because I rarely do an entire garment in Fairisle for the reasons we just talked about. The restriction here makes it less stretchy across the upper back, the bust, bending the elbow, any place that we enjoy the flexibility of a knit stitch that is reduced in a Fairisle garment. So very often it's used as an accent rather than a whole garment stitch pattern. You'll want to be able to figure your own hat, so you will need these numbers or an actual measurement of the person's head. I took most of these numbers from what the Yarn Council, the Craft Yarn Council lists. I agree with them, but notice that there's quite a range. 14 to 16 inches in a baby. Newborns are likely to be 14, possibly even smaller, and a year later, 16. They grow very fast. Plus, we vary. We vary as adults, and children certainly vary. So if possible, take a genuine measurement. Take it as shown here in the blue line, straight across, not at an angle. I've also added a measurement for American Girl dolls. I've seen other figures that range from my 11.75 to 12.5. That's a normal difference over the years of production of dolls, how big their hair is, and how you exactly measure. So we're going to go with mine because I'm satisfied with it, and we will actually make an American Girl doll hat. This is quite a range, and it isn't definitive. For example, I agree that this is a standard women's range, but I haven't met many women that actually have a 23-inch head circumference. My own is 21, and I'm not an extra tiny person, as that would sound like. We just vary. My husband's a good-sized man, and he's actually less than 22. He's between 21 and 22. This is why we measure if we possibly can. You cannot rely on any single chart. Also, there's the issue of negative ease. I don't like it in hats. I do wear it in socks. I want my hat to be 21 inches around, where it pops right over my head, and then I make it well fitted enough and long enough that it just stays there. Some people like them a lot snugger, up to 2 inches snugger. So some women my size would make 19-inch hats. You need to know that about the person you're knitting for, if at all possible. When in doubt, I would say use a little bit of negative ease, like 1 inch rather than 2. I think my personal taste is not the most common preference. So, to get the hat, we'll need the measurement of the head minus 0 to 2 inches of negative ease, as just discussed, so that it's snug. So we'll call that number, whatever we decide on, the desired measurement. We're going to multiply that by the gauge in stitches per inch and add 2. The 2 stitches are for the seam. That simple equation gives you the number of stitches to cast on. So for our sample hat, 11.75 is the circumference times 7. That 7 is my stitches per inch in the fabric that I'm knitting, and it equals 82.25. We cannot knit a quarter of a stitch, and it is not necessary to be that precise. So I'm just going to ignore that, round down to 82. 82 stitches that we actually need in the hat, plus 2 that we need in the seam, means 84 stitches to cast on. You can do this for anybody in any yarn, any size hat, using the exact same method. It's just that your desired circumference and your stitches per inch will vary with your yarn and the intended wearer. Next, hat lengths. If you want a snug-fitting beanie, these are the measurements that I usually use. Again, personal taste varies. If you want a slouch hat, it's the easiest thing in the world. Plus 2 inches. It can be plus actually up to 6 inches, depending how slouchy you want it. The fit around the skull is the same. The slouchy look comes from extra length. In this case, let's go with 5 for our American Girl doll sample. I'm getting 10 rows per inch, so that is just as easy as it can be. I'd need 50 rows. But there is one thing we have to keep in mind. The hem is going to take up some of our length. I'm going to make it 1 inch deep, so that's 10 rows. But it will also have an underside because it's doubled. This is where the fabric folds. So the hem will in fact be 20 rows, although the face of the fabric that we see on the outside of the hat will be 50. 4 inches will come in the stockinette area above the hem. So that, in my case, is 40 rows. Then we will change to Fairisle, knit 10, then change to the lining color, and knit another 10, just in plain stockinette. The cast on is up here, and we will eventually gather that to finish the hat crown. Very, very simple hat style. No shaping, just gathered. I'm going to show you an easy way to cast on something that will facilitate gathering. And this hat will be knitted top down. To cast on the way I plan to, we need a long strand of yarn. I'm going to use it doubled, so just to be safe, I've made my strand about 4 times the total span of the needles. Doesn't really take that much, but you'll see why. Now I'm going to fold it in half and hang that fold on the needle on the opposite end from the carriage. under one, over one, under, over, all the way across, making sure to treat my doubled strand as though it was one and not let it get caught as it tries to do. It wants to split and do that, surround a needle, but I want it to go over and under like one big strand of yarn all the way across. Here's my excess hanging down here. I really was generous. If I'm worried about it, I can hang a clothespin on it to make sure it stays down and out of the way. I'm not very worried because I did leave quite a lot. Now I've got my carriage threaded. Don't forget to make sure it's truly threaded, because this machine will fool you. I've got the carriage set so it'll knit back from hold, which is what I want. And this is the first of 40 rows. For the first few, especially while other people are watching me, to make sure nothing gets dropped before I can put my claw weights on comfortably, I bring my needles out and knit back from hold again. 3 rows will usually be fine. Here comes the third. And by that time I should be able to get claw weights on. And here they go. I'm pulling them towards me, which is not my usual way, but it's because I'm using a table that isn't really a knitting table, and I don't want to catch these weights on the shape of the edge of it. Okay, that was 3, 4, 5, 6. That was row 35, 6, 7, 8, 9. And I'm going to stop one row short of my goal of 40 rows to do a little trick. This is not an essential part of the pattern, but it sure helps, and you'll see why. Let's change to our second color of yarn now. Row 40 in red. And this is actually just going to make a marker for us. Now it's time to do our Fairisle work. We'll do a super simple design, just using every other button down. And we will also be varying the design by moving this knob. That will effectively change the needles that are selected without ever changing the buttons. Because, let's see if I can show you. See the whole pattern center moving? And right here it's telling you which needles are actually going to be involved in the pattern, and they're shifting. So without doing any more fooling around with the buttons, we can get a one red, one white, one red, and so on pattern. And then when we rotate, we'll get the same thing, but it'll be shifted over a needle. So it will make little checks. We'll be engaging both part buttons for this, and we will ratchet this to select every single row. I ratcheted, and that's what we got. Now it's time to knit a row with red. And everything in this version of Fairisle is done 2 rows at a time. There's another way to do it, but this is far the simplest way. Ratchet. My right hand was out of your view, and I ratcheted with it. So we may have seemed to knit 2 rows, but if you look closely, you can see the floats forming. Nothing at all has been knitted on this needle or any of the others that are across corresponding to it, every other needle. So now we need to select for those and knit 2 white rows. Coming over. That will mean the alternate group of needles selects. Now I will change colors in the carriage, ratchet and knit. Ratchet. Let's take a close look at what happened. And we can see that the needles that did not knit before are the ones that came forward. Knit the row. Success. Ratchet again without changing which needles are selected, and knit the row. So we've caught up to ourselves. Now there are, in fact, 2 whole rows in Fairisle knitted on every needle. The red yarn is resting. The white yarn is in the feeder. I'm going to swap them. There are some tricky little things that you can do and change that, but to get a predictable pattern in the simplest way, let's just switch back to red. This stitch, this needle, and every other one along down, knitted white last time. This time I'd like it to knit red. Therefore, I'm not going to change the selection. I'm just going to ratchet. Did the white needles come forward? Indeed they did. Still with both part buttons in. Knit. Ratchet. Knit. The alternate ones will knit white. I'll rotate this, change the yarns in the feeder, and we'll do 2 rows of white. Select, knit, select, knit. At this point, we just keep repeating the actions we've already taken for the proper number of rows. In my case, I can only do 20 passes of the carriage. That will be 10 rows because I want a 10-row hem. They don't all have to be Fairisle. I may make the last 2 plain knitting. I'm preparing to do my last 2 rows, and I want to point out something I don't think we've talked about. The forward needles are the ones that you will see actually receive stitches. So this is unlike stockinette. It's because we're using both part buttons. So I've got the white yarn threaded. Take note that it's the 2nd, 4th, and so on, needles across, that should accept stitches. And let's see if that's exactly what happened. And it is. So the needles that are in normal working position are actually resting at this setting. I'm going to finish with 2 rows of red. I want a total of 10 hem rows on the face of the fabric, the outside of it. So since I've already accomplished 8, though they are composite rows, I have only 2 more plain rows to knit in red to finish the outside of the hem. Remember to change back to plain knitting or you won't get the expected results. That should be the outside of the hem complete. Now I'm going to release the red and rethread with white and use that for the lining of the hem. Set for white, I'm going to change one thing. Going to go down 1 stitch size so that the back of the hem doesn't sort of bubble out and be fatter than the exterior. Because remember, the Fairisle will have pulled the exterior part of the hem in a little bit. 1 stitch size is an estimate, but it usually works for me. So 10 rows like this. Now we want to close the hem. This is why I knitted the contrasting row, because it makes it very easy to find. And I'm only going to hang every other stitch along it. At this gauge, that's plenty to close the hem. Here's a little trick. You can use your triple prong tool. If you skip a strand and then grab 2 with 1 skipped between them, make sure you skip a needle. Doesn't matter if this middle prong lands on a needle, because nothing will happen because it did. I pick them up with a rocking motion, like that. Skip that one. I want the next alternate 2. Rock. If you want to hang every stitch across, it's okay, and sometimes that's more suitable, but this saves a little time if it works in your gauge and yarn. It also makes a little bit less bulk. Let's see, those are the 2. A little bit less bulk at the seam that closes the hem. So I'll work across and do that, and then we'll bind off. All hung. You may bind off any way that suits you as long as it retains enough stretch to pull the hat on over the head. But what I'm going to do is a favorite. It's binding off around the gate pegs. I have whole movies on this, so I'm not going to belabor the point. But basically, your latch tool hook goes in the needle hook, you pull it back, make a new stitch, and make that stitch around the gate peg, and that leaves the work hanging on the gate peg very conveniently, and also spaces it. Let me state that a little differently. It spaces the stitches, or tensions the chain stitch that we're making, in a convenient way that usually has the right amount of tightness. If it was too tight, you could go around 2 gate pegs like that and get a bigger chain stitch. But since I know that I didn't use negative ease, I shouldn't need more room than this. Here it is. Now, should you not like the way it looks yet, do not be dismayed. Right off the machine, it's not finished. I'm going to insert a needle in here, anything slender and stiff that'll fit in. And the point is to give the hem a good lengthwise stretch. I'll set those stitches. Look at the difference before and after. It's quite striking. And that business of the hem tending to flip out is greatly reduced. In fact, it's completely gone. It will remain if you got some proportions wrong. For example, the reason that I did reduce the stitch size for the lining of the hem is to avoid that flipping out business. And the reason that I hung every other stitch and thus made this seam lighter was to help too. But it does. It works very well. The whole thing should be pulled lengthwise. Now on one end of the top, you can't see the gathering thread at all. Here is the other end of it, and it's doubled, so it'll be nice and strong. And I just need to get a hold of it good and pull it. Because it is doubled, you have to pull the correct pair together. Oh, look, it's coming together. Now, when I cast off, I left a good long yarn tail. So I'll weave in the red ones. They're not necessary for anything except to keep those stitches secured. And I'll use the white ones to seam the back seam of the hat. Now I can trim that red one. This white one is too short to do anything with. It's from the cast on. Pull that through. Right into the hem. Now I can just pull these up and snip. We'll do that. If I pull a little, when I release it to normal, those ends will just disappear. There we go. I love the doubled gathering thread method because when you use this simple style of hat, That thread is all that's between the weather and the person's head. If it comes loose, the hat comes apart. So I like it to be sturdy, and that's why I do what I'm doing here, stitch across and knot a couple of times. You can cover this gathered area with a pom-pom, or a tassel, or a button, or nothing at all. Personally, I don't use pom-poms for me because it's just an invitation for something horrible to happen and they end up looking scraggly. Some people love them though, and it's not difficult to make one. Okay, that's adequately snug. Since it's on the inside, I don't trim the yarn tail super short. I don't want this knot to back out, and it's not in anybody's way. So now all that's left is to thread one of these into the yarn needle and seam. All finished.